Thank you, Na'eem, for being willing to answer our questions for our film. You have written an article on thinking about nation building. And I was just, 2014 has been such a horrendous year for Palestine, with Gaza, massive destruction and loss of life. In the West Bank, colonization rampant. East Jerusalem, demolition. The hatred that Netanyahu said, specifically mentioned in the end of his electoral campaign, when he talked about hordes of Arabs, forgetting that they were citizens, of going out to vote and vowing that as long as he was president, there would be no resolution of the conflict. So this is the dismal side of it, and you are suggesting that we should think about what's going to happen. How can we prepare for the future and the end of this conflict? So I suppose we have difficulty imagining the end of the conflict, but you have lived through a horrendous situation in South Africa, so you give us hope somewhere.
Well, I mean, we should be under no illusion and should not think that that Palestinians are going to be liberated this year or next year, or I don't think in the next 5 years. The point of that chapter in the book is that, and this draws in a sense on our experience in South Africa, and that is that you need to plan for when liberation does come, and particularly around the national question in South Africa. We didn't do enough planning, we didn't do enough talking, enough debating. Even among black people we didn't, let alone with whites, who we knew during the struggle in the 1970s or in the 1980s that whites would be part of a new South African society and a new South African nation. But we didn't do enough to address that question, and we didn't do enough to plan about how both blacks and whites could feel part of a new nation as equals. And there's various things that I think we still need to do 20 years after our first democratic election in South Africa. And so the idea of that chapter that we wrote was to talk about, in the Palestinian-Israeli case, that yes, the end of the struggle will come sometime down the line. We made the assumption, and I think it's a correct assumption, that end will be a one-state solution, that you will not end up with a Palestinian state and an Israeli or a Jewish state. You will have one state, and it's becoming clearer as the days go by that is going to be the situation. How will then Palestinians and Jewish Israelis live together in one state? Whether it is some kind of a binational state or whether it's a simple secular democratic state, one person, one vote, etc. How would they be able to live together and see each other as fellow citizens and as part of the same nation? And knowing that nations are always constructed. They're not natural things. They are constructed. What work needs to be done is the question that we're asking. What work needs to be done now in order to move towards that? So when this resolution, however it looks like at the time, when the resolution does happen, how can the day after Palestinians and Jewish Israelis move on with their lives? So our argument is that task of beginning to create a new nation, and I don't know to call it Palestinian or Israeli or whatever, I don't know, whatever they might decide to call it, whenever they decide to start calling it something, but whatever it is, the question is, how should Palestinians and Jewish Israelis start now to start constructing and imagining a new nation in that part of the world? We don't really have many answers for that, but that's the question that we putting on the table to be asked. And I think that in the chapter we raise a few kind of considerations. Again, drawing on the South African example, but not fully on the South African example. So the one issue, for example, is that whatever Palestinians and Palestinian solidarity activists might think, etc., the truth and the reality is that Jewish people, particularly older Jewish people, not only in Israel but around the world, have a particular kind of memory about what happened in this part of the world over half a century ago. And they have a very real fear based on that. A very real fear that there were people, and there were people not only 60 years ago, but there were people over centuries who wanted to just get rid of Jews. And Hitler kind of, epitomizes that in a sense. But during the Crusades, when the crusading armies went to Jerusalem to fight Muslims, they first practiced on Jews often. So Jews have a particular kind of fear. I might say that in today's world that fear is unjustified, but perhaps my saying that would be unjustified. If you grow up with that kind of idea and you have an experience that's only half a century old. And so a new nation in Palestine, Israel, needs, for example, as far as the Jewish part of that nation is concerned, to be able to address that kind of fear. The fear that Jews have that they could live in that territory peacefully with Palestinians as their neighbors and without having to fear that their neighbors are going to one day turn on them, try to get rid of them, etc. Now, those kind of fears can be addressed through dialogue, but they can also be addressed through constitutional means and other means, and those are the questions that need to be asked. For Palestinians who have suffered more than 6 decades of oppression, of exploitation, of land theft, occupation, colonialism, etc., and I'm talking about Palestinians in all the different locations that they have. So whether you talk about Gaza, the West Bank, Jerusalem, within Israel, or the refugees, for Palestinians, a feeling of being part of a new nation needs to mean that there's a way in which the past injustices that they have suffered will be addressed. So a redress of these injustices of the past 6.5 decades must feature. What does that mean? How do they feel that they are being acknowledged, that their suffering is being acknowledged, and that not only being acknowledged, but that there are mechanisms being put into place in order to redress that suffering and that loss that they have experienced over the past 65 years. Because if that doesn't happen, Palestinians will not be able to see themselves as being part of the same nation as Jewish Israelis, except perhaps the more privileged and more elite among them. And that certainly comes out of our own experience. So 20 years into democracy in South Africa, a small slice of black people have been enriched by democracy, have become part of the upper middle and upper classes, have joined the capitalists, etc. But the vast majority of black South Africans still live in the same kind of poverty that they did. So this is not to say that nothing has changed. A lot has changed in the past 20 years, but you have the mass of black African South Africans that still suffer with poverty. South Africa now is the most unequal society in the world. And so that small slice of black people that have reached above have just joined the white elite. So South Africa today, the wealth of the country is still owned, 85% of it is still owned by white people. That redress hasn't happened. We had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was supposed to have addressed issues of gross human rights violations, and to some extent it was successful in doing that. but there were a number of things that were not regarded as gross human rights violations. The indignity that black people suffered on a daily basis through the past laws and through being dumped into the Bantustans and in townships, etc. Those things haven't been addressed. And not addressing them means that we can talk as much as we like about South Africa being a rainbow nation, this very nice cliche. Frankly, it doesn't mean much. It doesn't mean much because white people are still sitting pretty in the main. There's, now we actually have unemployed white people, which we didn't previously under apartheid. So we do have some unemployed white people, but in the main, white people are still sitting pretty, still have the privileges that they previously did. And black people in the main are still poverty-stricken and at the bottom of the pile. Unless these things can be addressed and black people can feel like they can regard themselves as equals to the whites with whom they stand in the same line to vote, but after voting go back to a shanty while the other one goes back to a mansion. If they can't feel themselves equal, then you're not going to create, you're not going to be able to talk properly about a South African nation. And I think that as time goes on, if we don't address this, and the urgency becomes more and more because we should have addressed it 20 years ago. But the further we go away from that, the urgency becomes greater. And if we don't address it, it will unravel in ways that could be actually very scary for all of us South Africans. Some of that unraveling we've seen taking place recently with attacks against foreigners. Foreigners are the most vulnerable targets, the easiest targets. And so they're the ones that are getting targeted. And poor foreigners, of course, are the most vulnerable targets. So foreigners or immigrants from Europe are not targeted in the xenophobic violence. They have better positions, socioeconomically, etc. But that's, I think, for me, the beginning of the unraveling. The beginning of the problem of not addressing the national question, of not working towards creating a new nation. And I think that in the Palestinian case, if they make the same mistake we made, which is that they don't address or start addressing the national question from now, then you could have a new society and a new state and new mechanisms to elect leaders and all of that, but then it'll very quickly unravel as well.
Way of thinking about the future of what it could be, to put the basis at least in discussion now. I would say that maybe we are, as activists, are confronted with the problem of deconstructing, first of all, the Israeli discourse, because most people, and this is certainly what is vehicled in media, is the right of the Israeli population for peace, to live in peace and security. But it's never also said that the Palestinians have the right to peace and security and equality and justice. So is the paradigm of apartheid going to help us, the convention against it, to use these things, these laws that have been passed, these conventions that have been passed, are these going to be sufficiently strong enough? Are they going to give us the leverage to be able to change a bit the discourse?
Firstly, let me say that yes, I mean, all people have the right to live in peace and security. But I'm not sure that people who deny the peace of others and make the lives of others insecure deserve themselves to continue living in a protected bubble of so-called peace and security. If the entire society and the manner in which they operate towards others is one of violence, whether it's military violence or economic violence or violence in the denial of other people's rights, etc., then I'm not sure that those who perpetrate that violence should always deserve to live in that bubble of imagined peace and security. I think that the people who perpetrate violence should also feel a bit insecure at some times. On the apartheid issue, I think it can be a useful tool. Certainly, Israel is quite clearly an apartheid state. And when I say that, I'm referring not only to the manner in which Israel behaves in the occupied Palestinian territory, but also in the way it behaves towards its own citizens, Palestinian citizens of Israel. The treatment that they receive from the state is also a form of apartheid. And so Israel is very much an apartheid state. And yes, we can talk about this in terms of how it compares to South Africa, South African apartheid. But in my opinion, more importantly, to talk about whether it can be regarded as an apartheid state in terms of the International Convention on Apartheid, on the crime of apartheid. Interestingly, the convention never mentions South Africa, not even once. There's one reference to Southern Africa. It doesn't mention South Africa at all. And I think that the reason is quite clear. For the drafters of the constitution, apartheid is a political phenomenon that can be applied by any state anywhere in the world. Nothing special about South Africa and apartheid. Yes, we coined the term, but the phenomenon is not exclusively ours, and so it can apply anywhere else. And when you look at Article 2 of the Convention, which is the article that qualifies or that tells us what would qualify as apartheid, Israel fulfills virtually every clause of that. And so it is an apartheid state, even in terms of the convention. Now, I think the challenge then for Palestinians and for solidarity activists is to much more effectively use that tool that exists under international law. To use it to prove to the world that Israel is an apartheid state, and because it is an apartheid state, and not because black South Africans say so, but because a UN convention says so, because it is an apartheid state, according to that convention, there are certain punishments that it should face, like our other apartheid state faced, in order to force it to change. So I think we haven't used that instrument strongly enough. But I can also understand that for many Palestinians and for many solidarity activists, there's perhaps a bit of exhaustion with talking about international law, because Israel is in violation of around 80 Security Council resolutions, in violation of various clauses of the Geneva Conventions. All of this is international law, and they just don't care. So do we really want to bother about adding another one to that list? Well, I think we have to. If we just ignore international law, then what kind of world are we living in? Even if people violate it, we have to have something that we can say, this is our benchmark. And so international law is our benchmark. Some parts of what we regard as international law, some of us might not like. It might be too soft, whatever the case is. But it is a benchmark that, in a sense, all nations of the world have agreed to. So we have to use it. We're not using the Apartheid Convention enough or effectively enough against Israel. I hope that we will. And I hope that we will reach a situation where we can actually use it through legal means against apartheid and against Israel. And if it needs to be punished for it, then it needs to be punished for it. That's what the convention says.
This question of using international law, on one hand, last year, Richard Falk was here in Geneva and said international law is on the side of the Palestinians. We have to begin to use it, but we know that international law doesn't itself make it work if there's no pressure on the part of the civil society. But as you mentioned, there are people who say that there have been so many violations. There's such the pariah state gets away with everything. Why shouldn't we be using other discourses as well? So that's the question.
No, I think that for oppressed people and for those who are in support of oppressed people, every possible discourse and argument that can be used should be deployed. That's a strategic and a tactical decision. And so if strategically international law is the way to go, then that's what should be used. So it's the choice of people who live under that oppression about sorry. So I was saying that oppressed people need to deploy whatever they can and whatever is necessary at any point in time. I'm suggesting that the Apartheid Convention is one that can be used, and we should have a debate about it. Perhaps it's not the most appropriate to use right now. I think it is, and so we should choose whatever is best.
We have found practically in our campaigns here, when we go and talk with enterprises about the fact that they're selling Israeli products and they're violating their ethical code and this sort of thing, they always say, we don't get into politics. As long as the Swiss government has not taken a stand on it, then we won't do anything. So then we changed our discourse a bit and we started talking about international law and the obligations that enterprises have to aid or assist in an illegal situation. And it did have an effect. I mean, we haven't got major results, but to be able to say, you think that international law is important or not? Because if it's not, it's the law of the jungle. So if you think it's important, then you should abide by it. And this is what the law says. But I know that some people feel that, that it's...
I must say, I think you're very fortunate that you're able to convince businesses that international law is important, because frankly I don't think business operates with that kind of sense of morality. Unless they feel that the bottom line is going to be affected. I'm not saying that we shouldn't approach businesses and big corporations and say do the right thing, divest, etc. We should, of course, that's what BDS means as well. But for most corporates, unless the bottom line is going to be affected, they're not going to move in any kind of way. So in national contexts, if we can get laws changed that are going to affect businesses if they continue dealing with Israel, that would be great. If not, then it means that the boycotts have to take effect. So it's a good thing to approach businesses and say, this is what you're doing, this is what we think is wrong, and because it's a violation of international law, etc. And if you're not going to change your corporate behavior, then we're going to have to punish you as well. And that's what boycotts are there for, so that we can put pressure on you. But I think we shouldn't have too high expectations that they'll just go along because we ask them nicely and because international law says so. Even big corporates will, even if laws exist, they will first try their best to get around those laws. In the South African context, the call for the sanctions campaign, which is how we refer to it, which included boycotts and divestment, etc. The call was made in 1960s. It took about 20 years before it actually started getting taken up. And it started getting taken up by corporates that then divested from South Africa, not because they suddenly decided that racism was wrong, but because in countries where they operated, the anti-apartheid movement began to put pressure on them. And so they were forced to pull out of the country. And that's what needs to happen.
I had a question, you talked a bit about it already, but if you can tell us more of how it started in South Africa, the idea of the boycott, the divestment section, how that started, and so maybe the grands moments,
the defining moments in the campaign.
Yeah. So, in South Africa, the sanctions campaign began after various parts of the liberation movement were banned. And were forced into exile. So that included groups like the African National Congress, the South African Communist Party, Pan-Africanist Congress, etc. And once they went into exile, part of the strategy that was then developed was to form an international campaign that would isolate the apartheid state. And so that isolation was supposed to be at various levels, including, of course, diplomatic, which became very successful. So by the late 80s, just the African National Congress, even including the Pan-Africanist Congress, just the African National Congress had more diplomatic missions abroad than the South African government did. So it was diplomatic, but then in other ways, and that included boycotts, divestment, sanctions, etc. For a long time, it was talk, it was a call. it started to become effective or have the promise of becoming effective when the anti-apartheid movement began to get organized around the world. You know, whether it was in North America, in Europe, in parts of Asia, etc. Of course, some of the so-called third world countries by the late 70s had already cut off diplomatic and trade links with Israel, with South Africa. Some of them had cut off diplomatic links, but quietly had trade links. But when the anti-apartheid movement started gaining strength, it was able to take this forward. And you know, one of the big things was, for example, dock workers in the UK refusing to offload South African ships. Now, I'm not sure at the time that they realized what a big thing it was. Recently, we had in the US dock workers refusing to offload Israeli ships. This was during the war against Gaza last year. During the 2008 war in South Africa, dock workers refused to offload an Israeli ship. And then, you know, it began to take off. Firstly, of course, at the level of boycotts, because we have most influence on ordinary good people. And so it was the boycott campaign, not buying South African goods, whether it was fruits, vegetables, wines, other things. And the groundswell of that then helped people to put pressure on institutions like universities, city councils, and then companies. You also had certain politicians in the US, for example, African American politicians who began to put pressure on companies on whose boards they were or with whom they had influence, etc., to start either adhering to particular kind of codes of conduct or to divest. And the sanctions bit, in an effective sense, really came right at the end. Sure, there were many countries of the global south which had implemented sanctions on South Africa from the 70s. But European countries, apart from, for example, the Scandinavian countries, other European countries, North America, the US in particular, many of these never had sanctions against South Africa. I mean, the United States policy to apartheid South Africa was what Ronald Reagan called constructive engagement, which meant they were not going to do anything. They were forced at some point to implement an arms embargo against South Africa, which only resulted in South Africa developing its own arms industry. But apart from that, they were not willing to go any further. And the arms thing was because of the United Nations as well. Britain didn't have sanctions against South Africa, and so Britain, particularly under Margaret Thatcher and the US under Reagan, were big supporters of the apartheid state. But it was the efforts of ordinary people that put pressure on the governments at local level, state or provincial level, etc., and then on companies that made the difference. So by the end of the 1980s, you had a large number of companies, motor car companies, clothing companies, banks that had pulled out of South Africa, that had divested. And had no presence in South Africa. You had a boycott campaign that had become quite effective, so that South Africa could only export some of its products if it first sent it to Israel and had it labeled product of Israel, and other sanctions busting countries. So it had become quite effective. The South African state by then wasn't able to guarantee its own budget beyond a few months. And that's where we want to bring Israel, to a point where it feels the pinch, where it sees that there's a danger of not recognizing legitimate Palestinian demands. And I think we're far from there. So,
what was the academic and the cultural boycott like in South Africa?
Yeah. You know, in the South African case, the academic boycott, there was an academic boycott and cultural boycott and all of that. The academic boycott wasn't, in my opinion, as important as it is in the Israeli case. Of all of these, perhaps the most important in the South African case was a sports boycott. When we crazy sports people or love sports, and white communities in South Africa, particularly white men, can't do without rugby on a weekend, and English speakers cricket. So if you can't play rugby and cricket on the international stage, white people just get demoralized, and this is what happened. So what you had was the sports boycott demoralizing white people to the extent that they began to think there is something wrong. There's something wrong if our government can't guarantee that we can play sports internationally. So you had lots of rebel tours, you had kind of unofficial South African tours, which were then broken up, disrupted, etc. when they took place. You had some rebel tours from other countries that came to South Africa, which were then disrupted when they arrived in South Africa. Some of those players couldn't play when they went back home, etc. This had a very serious effect on white society in South Africa. I think the equivalent in the Israeli context is the academic boycott. Because on the morale of Israelis, of Jewish Israelis in particular, and being cut off from the rest of the world academically, or their institutions not being able to operate in the same kind of way with other institutions in the rest of the world, could have that kind of demoralizing impact. So, the intention of the academic boycott is not to make Israelis stupid. It's not to deprive Israelis of research or knowledge or any. It is to demoralize Israeli society in such a way that it is then willing and able to put pressure on its government to say things have to change, which is what we had in South Africa. Of course, the cultural boycott in South Africa was also quite strong. Less important, I think, than the sports boycott. But we had a situation where South African artists couldn't play overseas, couldn't perform overseas, and foreign artists refused to come to South Africa. In the UK, you had a very effective cultural boycott. One of the negative things about the cultural boycott was that we ended up being able to watch only American movies. So we all become a bit dulled by that. But that became quite effective as well. But certainly, I think the sports was the most important of those, apart from the economic ones. And in the Israeli case, it will be the academic boycott that will be as defining, I believe.
And were people against boycott from the movement? Were there also people, or maybe at the beginning, that were against that tool?
Within the anti-apartheid movement? In general, the anti-apartheid movement was united in supporting the sanctions campaign, which included boycotts and divestments. Those who were opposed to it were, of course, the vast majority of the white population, and among black people and black organizations, it was essentially the quislings, the collaborators with the state. So the most vocal against the sanctions campaign was Gacha Buthelezi, who was the head of the Inkatha organization at the time, and now the Inkatha Freedom Party, which was really an organization that was collaborating with the apartheid state. As well as later in the mid-80s, you had some of the parties which were some of the so-called Indian and so-called colored parties, which were part of the government's sham tricameral parliament, which didn't support the sanctions campaign. Again, they were, for the vast majority of black people, they were regarded as collaborators, and their opposition to sanctions was just an indication of that collaboration. But within the anti-apartheid movement, there really wasn't a difference of opinion on that. There might have been differences in terms of tactics, what to emphasize before what else, or that kind of thing. But or should a particular academic be given permission to come to South Africa because he or she is anti-apartheid or not? There might have been those kind of differences of opinion. But in general, no.
I agree with you on the importance of touching on an important fringe in the Israeli society who maintains this idea that, okay, the colonies, it's not the best thing, there have been faults, etc., but the core of our society is a democratic core, and we share European values, Western values, and so to hit that is really going to be important. But here the academic boycott is just beginning, and there's still a lot of work to be done. Many people say you have to allow the freedom of minds, the people to. And what would you answer to that about the fact that you could have these communities, be it the scientists or be it the culture, that these people somehow are not involved in the politics of their country?
Yeah, firstly, that's nonsense. Certainly in the Israeli context. And the academic boycott that Palestinians are calling for is an institutional one. They're not calling for individual boycotts of individual academics. That's their decision. That's a decision we have to accept. Even though some people might feel that an individual boycott is also a good thing, but that's what Palestinians want. So if you look at Israeli institutions, there's not many Israeli institutions, universities, research institutions, etc., that you can point to that actually have no role in propping up the state, in doing research for particularly the Israeli Defense Force, for the arms industry, the military complex, etc., in Israel. Or have some universities have branches in the settlements, which all these settlements are illegal under international law, and so those universities' presence there is illegal as well. So the notion that we're just scientific, we're just involved in knowledge and not politics is nonsense from that perspective. But in general, of course, it's nonsense. You can't be engaged in scientific and knowledge-based work without there being politics involved in any society. But also, I mean, if we look at the sports boycott campaign in South Africa, the same kind of thing would have been said or was said by white sports people. We have nothing to do with politics. We just want to play. We just want to play soccer. We just want to play cricket or rugby or whatever the case is. And I'm sorry, but the fact that the South African team was white means that politics is there, right? We had a good slogan in South Africa regarding sports. A slogan that was coined by SACOS, South African Congress on Sport. No normal sport in an abnormal society. And so I would say no normal academia in an abnormal society for Israel. And the fact that in large measure 20% of your population, Palestinians, are not completely excluded, but effectively don't have the same kind of access to knowledge production as Israeli Jews do, makes even your research community abnormal. Right? So you can't have normal academia in an abnormal society. You can't have normal academia and freedom of thought and freedom of inquiry in a society where that freedom is used to develop weapons to kill and oppress other people. So there's that argument in my mind doesn't make much sense. You can't simply extricate one part of a society's life from the rest of that society and say this stands on its own. That doesn't make sense. Yes, Israel actually is a very democratic society for Jews. South Africa was a very democratic society for whites. They had regular elections. They had, for white people, if we just forget that there were blacks in South Africa, South Africa was a fairly decent kind of social democratic society. Lots of problems, very kind of religiously right-wing, etc. But no white people were unemployed. They had regular elections. They had parliamentarians could even speak against the policies of the government and even speak against apartheid. You even had a white organization for that fought against conscription, the End Conscription campaign, right? So for white people, South Africa was a very democratic society, and Israel for Jews is a very democratic society. But that's not how we judge what democracy is. how is the rest of your society treated, and how democratically do you act with regard to others. And the others, in the case of Israel, are people that they have had under their control for the past 4.5 decades. People that live in the West Bank and Gaza, you might say that they are in the so-called occupied territories. Well, frankly, they are as much Israeli as anyone else, because they've lived under Israeli control and Israeli laws for 4.5 decades, and there's no indication that that's going to change anytime soon. And Netanyahu, you quoted earlier on, has made it clear that as far as he's concerned, that's not going to change. People in the West Bank and Gaza are going to continue to live under Israeli rule.